Welcome everybody who's joined us, and I can see lots of names of people who've joined already. We've called it the West Cornwall Focus on Climate Change, but it's to help us all to become better informed on how we can become more resilient to climate change, how the politics and the will to act are unfolding. So we've had quite a wide range of talks. Last time it was the spaceport, and next time hopefully we'll be having someone from the G7 task force to give a summary of what the actual achievements of COP26 were, what they achieved and what they failed to achieve. But today, Jonathan Howe, who is Mayor of Penzance, is going to introduce Manda Brookman to talk about Doughnut Economics.
Thank you, Pippa. So yes, as you heard, if you don't know me, my name is Jonathan Howe, and I've been Mayor of Penzance since May and on Penzance Council since 2017. So Manda has a wide array of involvements and interests, and the name of her organisation that she created, Cafe Disruptive, I think gives it all away somehow. But anyway, as her day job, she is Climate and Ecological Emergency Lead and Community Maker at Volunteer Cornwall, which in itself is quite a stupendous thing. And so I'm really pleased to invite her to speak to us this afternoon about the ideas behind Kate Raworth's Doughnut Economics. Thank you, Manda.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for that introduction, Jonathan, and thank you, Pippa and Beth, and everybody for inviting me. Lovely to be here. We can imagine it's a physical space. I was in a space with real people talking just today with some students, and it was such a treat to see people in 3D and have that interaction. But I think we're doing very well as human beings having this hybrid arrangement. So what I'm going to talk about today very briefly, and I have been given here a donut and a cup of tea by Jonathan in honour of the talk today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Doughnut Economics is. And we've got matching donuts. There you go. I'm downstairs in Jonathan's house to make sure I've got a decent internet connection. So what I'm going to do is share my screen and rattle through really some of the ways of describing Doughnut Economics, which is much simpler than anybody need fear, actually. We have developed a sense of economics being too complicated for us, which is absolute nonsense, and I'll come to that in a second. So I'll just share my screen and then we can go through some of the notions. And can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
You can. I think what I might do is, I wonder if, can anybody else turn my camera off? Stop video. I think it might give me, might ease the the bandwidth. Right. The first question is, what is the donut really? And I think quite a few people here will have done some reading or watched some videos or heard about it or seen that shape up to now. Before we go no further, I should say that when Kate Raworth, who invented the notion of Doughnut Economics on the back of another natural scientist, actually, not an economic scientist, which I'll come to in a moment, she put it together and said it reminded her of a life belt, and it was somebody else that referred to it as a donut, and the donut idea stuck. She refers to it as the only donut that might be good for you. So essentially, this is Kate. She refers to herself as a renegade economist. She's been working with Oxfam and teaching at the University of Oxford in lots of different ways over the years, working with lots of different groups, lots of different ways of teaching, lots of different ways of engaging, fundamentally disrupting some very old and wrong ideas about what economics is and isn't. And really it came about with her considering the Sustainable Development Goals, which, as you may well know, are a series of aspirations of the globe to ensure that everybody gets a fair deal, really. They are to do with people, really, but people in the context of planet and the economy. There are 17 of them. I think some of them might be a little bit out of date now, possibly, but they are universally acknowledged, set up by the UN as a means of ensuring that we've all got the same sort of metric of success in terms of well-being and fairness. And what happened was, Kate realised that if you put all the big things that are to do with the natural environment and the tricky issues that Rockstrong, who was that natural scientist some years ago, started looking at, things like climate change, freshwater use, nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, ocean acidification, etc., and then down to some other issues that are very important from a social perspective: water, food, gender equality and social equity. If you put them in a list, they just become exhausting before you've even started, because it just looks like a really, really big to-do list of very, very complicated things. And what Kate clocked is that when you put them in a picture, they're rather easier to start getting your head around. So the outside circle, where it says environmental ceiling, are the 9 planetary boundaries that were put together by Rockstrong pre-2009. And Rockstrong essentially said, if we split those big planetary boundaries up, we can see that in actual fact, where some of the use of them is taking us into overdraft space, if you like. They're busting through that environmental ceiling. And we were doing that already in 2009 across at least 4 of them. We were overstepping the limits of the planet. With the others, we weren't even sure about. We didn't actually know whether we were overstepping the boundary because we didn't have enough data, because we have taken as a species from the planet without ever bothering to decide whether in actual fact there was enough left to take any more. What Kate did was she said, okay, well, those are those external, that environmental ceiling, those planetary boundaries. What if in actual fact we consider the middle bit as the things that people need? So the outside is the limits of the planet, and the inside is where people sit. And what she's saying is, if you haven't got enough of those things: food, water, income, education, resilience, voice, jobs, energy, social equity, gender equality and health, if you haven't got enough of what you need, then you are left in the hole in the middle. If we take too much, then we bust through. She talks about the safe and just space for humanity. She's talking about the meat, if you like, or the flesh of the donut. Everything we do needs to be safe enough not to bust through those environmental planetary boundaries, and just enough to make sure that nobody's left behind in the middle. So all of our economic activity needs to be measured to show that it sits in the green donut, not in the blue space in the middle or the blue space outside the edge. So for example, you might say, well, I've got lots of food and lots of water and lots of income in actual fact, so I'm definitely not in the middle. I've got loads and loads and loads, but it turns out the house you live in and the job you lead and the lifestyle that you lead is actually pushing the limits of the planet, and you might be personally busting your own budgets in terms of climate change or land use or biodiversity loss. So that's not on. So it's making sure that everybody's got enough in such a way that we don't bust out those planetary boundaries. And that, in an essence, is what Doughnut Economics is all about, based on the premise that previously economics has been presumed to be extracting and building and growing. Now, clearly on a finite planet, you cannot extract and build and grow forever. And what Kate's trying to do is join things up in a circle and make sure everything we do is contributing to the place so that we don't take from it, but we actually make it better. She refers to them as those outside things as the critical life support systems, and she refers to that, which is what Rockstrong, in 2009 and then Kate in 2017, those red bits are where we are overshooting on the planet, or underperforming or undersharing in terms of those social goals in the middle. So in every single one of the social goals, there are people with not enough. And at least 4 of those planetary boundaries, we are taking too much. And with the others, I mean, I would say now, ozone layer, we've got much more under control than we did. Air pollution, we don't. Ocean acidification. Parts of India have actually closed down cities this week because of the quality of air pollution. And even in this country, 120 people a day die in this country because of the quality of the air that they breathe. That's in this country every single day. That's way before COVID. Nothing to do with COVID, that's just because of the way in which we burn fossil fuels. So what Kate is saying really is, imagine if we started making decisions based on this. If every decision we made about every shop, about every home, about every transport infrastructure, about every aspiration about what we created in our places, in our homes, in our communities, were to consider all of those sustainable development goals in the middle and made sure every one of those was being hit fairly to enable everybody to have enough of those, but nothing we did was actually crashing through that external boundary. Imagine if planning systems did that. Imagine if shops did that, if businesses did that, if they genuinely included everything on all of those lists. And what's happening now is, because the notion is so elegant and so simple, it's economics as if people and place mattered, which is not the first time this has been discussed. I know that Jonathan Porritt wrote about that a very long time ago. In fact, many people have been writing about this for a really long time. But unfortunately, a very wrong-headed grip on economics has been with us for quite some time. And the presumption is that the metric is growth, that GDP means success. And if you think about it, going for a walk in the woods and enjoying the trees and the fresh air and maybe picking some wild mint for tea contributes so much to your well-being and your physical health and nothing to GDP. Whereas if you drive into work and get involved in mining gold, say, and then drive home and have a crash and end up in hospital and need a new car, all of those things contribute to GDP. So the stuff that is good for us by that metric contributes nothing, and the stuff that's bad for us contributes a lot. And that is the only metric of success we have used for quite some time. So it's to do with what we've decided to measure that is fundamentally the problem here. Amsterdam, as always, edgy and moving ahead, decided to start looking at this donut issue in order to mend its post-coronavirus economy. And they put together, this was in 2020, they put together a citywide partnership of all sorts of organisations, civic society and economic bodies and environmental bodies and social bodies, to start looking at what a donut-based economy for the city might look like. And they developed what they call a tool for transformative action. You can find it online, where they've looked at all the different areas, and not just all the different areas, but crucially how they can housing for everybody. How can you make sure that the housing you build isn't actually causing a biodiversity problem or a climate problem, or if in actual fact the food that you're growing and making sure that everybody's got enough of isn't actually causing an issue in terms of land change or fresh water use or nitrogen and phosphorus loading. It's just encouraging people to join the dots. And there is actually loads happening everywhere on this now on the basis of this, because it's just common sense. And I would controversial comment and say that certainly up to now, any parent, particularly a mother who's been looking after their children and their home and their job, has been doing this for a long time. It's been multitasking, thinking about everything at once, Rubik's Cube thinking, where you have to make sure that everybody is okay and that the house is safe and that you're generating enough income, but you're not doing it in such a way that people are suffering or being left behind. It's just a matter of joining up. So in 2018, we put together a community event called the Cornwall Doughnut Hack, where we put 120 people in a room and we said, okay, this is the donut, what does it mean? And we spent all day just looking at all those different issues, trying to figure out who was in Cornwall already that had some information on what we were doing in Cornwall in terms of our water use, our political equality, our climate change impact, our nitrogen and phosphorus loading, all of those issues, just to try and see what it was. An extraordinary event. It was very, very complicated to run because everybody was talking about everything all at once. And it was an extraordinary adventure into multidimensional thinking. And also understanding that we've got lots and lots and lots and lots and lots to offer in terms of our understanding and our expertise. On a smaller scale, we've been using the same notion working with community groups, the Helston Climate Action Group, which is probably one of the most extraordinary climate action groups currently active. There are now 50 odd climate action groups across Cornwall, actually. They were one of the first. They started putting together this really innovative and far-reaching, far-thinking climate action plan. 2 or 3 years ago, did a lot of thinking about it, and then we went through a donut appraisal. So each project that they were thinking of within their climate action plan went through a donut analysis. And I'll give you an example. If you wanted to think about Incredible Edible or a local transport plan or maybe a bike repair workshop, if you went through each of those sustainable development goals and each of those planetary boundaries, can you say whether you're contributing positively or negatively to each of them? And what we found, with one example being a bike repair program or workshop, is that it's doing brilliant on health, brilliant things on carbon, brilliant things on transport, brilliant things on providing a sense of community and tackling loneliness. But what it hadn't done was think about gender equity, simply because it's quite possible for a project of that nature only to be welcoming to boys and men about repairing bikes. All they needed to do in order to make sure they were delivering on the gender equity bit of the Sustainable Development Goals in the middle was to make sure that they made it possible and welcoming to girls and mums. That's all they needed to do, is like a little tweak in their thinking, and suddenly they could see how that project, which is already doing a ton of really good stuff, could actually start contributing to even more. That's all it took. I put together what's called a playbook, a Doughnut Economics playbook, where you can actually go through some very simple stages as a group. It could be a bunch of mates at a pub, it could be a community group, it could be a business, just to sort of start flexing your donut muscle. And it's available online, it's available on the Deal website, the Doughnut Economics website, which we'll come to in a moment. And then in 2020, we brought together what's called the Cornwall Donuts Collective. And I'm thinking that my donut looks remarkably like those donuts in the back of that screen there. And it was simply to bring together everybody that was trying to think about the donut and see how it all matched. And we were talking to theatre groups, and we were talking to National Trust and Sustainable Tourism groups, and we were talking to community groups, and we were talking to land-based groups, talking to the university and the council, and what are we all doing on the donut, and how can we share our experience? So the Cornwall Doughnut Collective was born, and it's a way of bringing together people who are thinking about using the donut in a million different ways, because the point is you can use it in any way you want. You just need to make sure you use it well. So on that event, we worked with a lovely, fantastic local illustrator called Keith Sparrow, and he just helped encapsulate some of the things that they were talking about and some of the issues that came up, talking about those sustainable development goals, talking about how do we take this forward, how do we make it real on the land, how do we incorporate social justice, how do we consider investing in excluded groups, how do we consider our own consumption, how do we make sure that everybody has a voice and that we understand where we are already? And how do we deal with some of those tough questions about, are we being fair? Are we being inclusive? Are we making sure that everybody is involved? Talked about sports, talked about cultural equality, minority arts, getting off your laptop and into the community. We considered the issue of what growth actually is. It was a fantastic session. And I think probably pertains to everything, and all of the great things that you know in the community probably are doing a ton of stuff on the donut. And if they went round the inside ring and the outside ring, they'd realise that they were contributing to lots of things all at once. And that makes you feel really even more powerful than you were before. That, oh yeah, this is really cool. And if we did it just this way, then we could make sure we were doing something over here as well. So it moves away from this sense of linear thinking and that's not our job. Well, it is. It's all of our jobs. All of this is all of our jobs. We took the notion of Doughnut Economics into the council about 3 years ago, I think, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, to say, we think this is a great idea. We're sort of doing it on the ground anyway. It would be brilliant if the council were able to start making decisions based on this and to embrace it. And so we took lots of information in, and we took a YouTube clip of Kate doing a talk to say, it's brilliant, what's not to love about this? And in due course, the council developed what they're calling the decision-making wheel. Now, there's lots more to be done on this, and Peter Lafort, who was one of the ones involved in doing this, would say that it's an iterative process, that each time you go back to the donut, it's a way of sort of moving it further and further into the system. But essentially, the point of it is every time somebody came up with a new project inside the council, the idea they would then go to Peter's team and say, and this is where we are delivering positively on all of the counts. And this is where we haven't got enough information, and this is where there might be a negative impact. And so Peter's team would say, okay, well, can you go back and find the information that you haven't got on the bits that you don't know, and see if you can turn your negative impact into a positive impact. And if that means changing a project, then that means changing a project. And that was the idea. So that is the decision-making wheel. You can see here it's being used to consider the Saints Trail, which is one cycling and walking, I think a walking trail that the council was involved in investing in. and a number of different local authorities up and down the country. And we're very impressed by this because it was a particular way of maybe using the wheel to consider more thinking. There's more to do on that, but it was a great start. The Doughnut Economics Lab is where you can go to find out much more about this. It's international, creative and diverse, and it is, as Kate says, a place for pioneering change makers to come together to inspire others and to get inspired by what other people are doing. And they're doing all sorts on there. You can find it at doughnut-economics.org. It's available to everybody. You can see the stuff that we've been doing on Cornwall there. And they break it up into communities and art, cities and places, education and research, business as enterprise, government and policy. So there's lots of different ways of looking through the site to see, and it is properly international. So that's doughnut-economics.org, or the DEAL website, DEAL, the Doughnut Economics Action Lab. This is one example of a 7-step guide to introducing a donut day in your school. And it's classified as a teaching tool, as a methodology, and it's a way in which children can get involved. You can see their Donut Friday on their blackboard. So if children are getting their heads around donut economics, I would highly encourage all the grown-ups to as well. Just a quick word on the notion of donut, actually. There's something in the chat, but I don't think I can see it, so I don't know if it's a question or not. And maybe Beth would have a look at that for me. The word economics has got nothing to do with money, actually. The word economics comes from the Greek oikos, which means place or surround or hearth or home or environment. The omics of it comes from onomy, to land, in the same way that oikos and ology, creating ecology, come from logos, which is to know. So economy really is about managing our home, and ecology is about knowing our home. And to my mind, I don't understand, I don't believe you can manage something without knowing it. And so I don't think you can be an economist without being an ecologist. Unfortunately, we've got a situation where ecologists are seen as weird and a bit tree huggy, and economists rule the world. I think that's what we need to change at the moment. So if you do go onto the DEAL website, you'll see all sorts of different examples of different people using it in planning sessions, in artistic and creative sessions, in community sessions, in economic development sessions, all sorts of groups looking at how they can use this as a tool. And it is only a tool. Kate's the first person to say, quoting George Box, that all of these are a model, and all models are wrong because they're only a model. They're only representing something, they're not the thing itself. So George Box says all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think that's what Kate wants people to understand with this. It's a model, it's not perfect, and it can be useful. So use it, make it useful. So going back to that playbook, you can find that online as well on the website. You can see there, they've got all sorts of things there, from the Cornwall Donut Hack, Peter Lafort's responding to the climate emergency with the decision-making wheel, and the playbook. So there's lots of stuff in there that you can see. So the question really is, for all of us, given that lots and lots of people are thinking about this already, in fact, over the last couple of days, Shalal Dance and Theatre Company have just published an amazing piece of a dance interpretation of Doughnut Economics, where they express taking too much and taking not enough, and making sure that we share, and understanding that it's about bringing everybody together. So have a look at that. It was funded by Feast. You can find it on the Shalal, SHALLAL YouTube site, and it's absolutely beautiful. So there's lots of different ways of thinking about the donut, and the question to us, of course, is in relation to everything. And I have opinions on this as well. I have opinions on how it's used and how it can be misused, and how we need to make sure that it isn't misused, how it can encourage us to think properly in terms of multidimensional Rubik's Cube thinking, where we think about everything at once. Because if we care about people who are around us, then we do think about everything at once. We don't just think of one thing at a time. That's not the way that we can find our way through the multiple crises we see at the moment, and maybe using the donut is one way that we can. So thanks very much indeed. I know there are comments in the chat. I'm going to stop sharing now and see if people want to contribute their thoughts.
So yeah, thank you, Manda. So we've got a few comments to keep on putting things in. So David Smart Knight has asked, he's saying that it's clear that GDP, gross domestic product, is failing as a metric. what other metrics would be intelligent to be using?
That's a brilliant question, David. We're way behind the curve on this. We're still stuck on GDP. In fact, if you just listen to the radio, you hear properly trained, allegedly, journalists saying things like, oh, it's very, very bad, economic growth is down, or it's very, very good, economic growth is up, as if it's somehow a shared understanding that this is good or bad. Clearly, if people haven't got enough, then we absolutely need to make sure that the economic activity that's happening is giving them what they need. But if we only measure growth, it's not necessarily measuring the benefit that can accrue. So if you look at places like Costa Rica, who've been looking at an index of happiness, you look at a number of different small island states that are thinking differently if they're not being completely subsumed by climate change. If you look at New Zealand, who have considered what's being called a well-being economy. And in Scotland, there is a well-being alliance, well-being economics alliance, where they're looking at different ways of measuring well-being as a fundamental purpose of economic activity, not growth, well-being. If your economy is growing, as ours still is at the moment, your emissions grow. It doesn't mean that your well-being grows. You know, we've had £1.5 billion of structural funding into Cornwall over the last 10, 15 years. It's clearly done some good, but we also know that some of the poorest estates, some of the poorest estates in the UK before we got EU structural funds, are now not only still poorest, they're even poorer than they were when we started. So lots of money in a GDP metric isn't necessarily the way of ensuring that it's shared well, or it's not delivering social and environmental growth as opposed to economic growth. So have a look at the Wellbeing Alliance website and see what they're doing, because they're gathering together the people who are using sensible ways of measuring benefit, not just GDP.
Just related to that, Andrew has said on metrics, maybe gross domestic provision, a measure extent to which the lower three tiers of Maslow's hierarchy of need are met. I can't remember which ones those are. I can imagine they're the survival ones.
Yeah, well, it's shelter and food. Absolutely right. That it's and you could say that the centre of the donut is talking about that social provisioning. It is about provisioning. Absolutely. And we know what makes us happy. It's being in beautiful places with people that we care about. It's not stuff. Stuff's only ever a proxy. If you look at very, 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 very unhappy people that are very wealthy, there's usually been some mismanagement of understanding as to what it is that makes them happy. It's not stuff and money. It's actually people. Clearly, we need enough to eat and be sheltered. And after that, things drop off. I'm just going to go to that question about the spaceport, as that's a really, really good question. And me personally, I think that was an absolute misuse of the donut. And that's why it's really important to understand it as a tool, and it needs to be used well. You could say the same about anything. It could, you know, a hammer's really, really brilliant for building something, but it can also harm us hugely. It can be used as a weapon. So we need to make sure that the tools that we've got are used well and transparently and honestly. And I think using something like a Doughnut Economics based tool to justify something like a spaceport is a misunderstanding of what the tool is for. And it's either an indication of people not understanding, or it's an indication of deliberate misuse. And I don't know which one it is, to justify something that somebody wanted to do anyway. I'm not saying that people were practicing deceit. I think it's about people having decided they want to do X, so they're going to use Y to justify it, rather than actually going through a proper process with rigor that kicks the tires of their project. So I have a problem with that as well, actually. And I think we can do much better. And
it very much relates, it's a very similar case, isn't it, to the subsidising of flights from Newquay Airport. I think what it raises for me is how you deal with that transition to a different kind of economics. And I think that's the difficult bit, isn't it, really, where you could find loads of projects that fitted nicely into the donut, but they wouldn't make any money, or they would lose money, even worse, you know, and therefore they're seen as not good for that reason. I mean, interestingly, with the Penzance town deal application, it was stated very much on page 1 that everything in there fitted in with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which is really great. Of course, the stage that it's at now is that every one of those projects has to prove their business case. And they could be nice fluffy things that fitted in the donut, but we'll see what happens next.
That's a really good point. Sorry, Pippa.
Sorry, no, you carry on.
I was going to say that's a really good point, is that if we are, you know, I've been involved in a health program recently where a business case had to be made for looking after people with poor respiratory health. And I just think it's a complete misframing of what we're talking about. How can you need a business case to make sure somebody is well? What is that? Are we reducing even that to metrics? Clearly, it's about using money well. But if it's fundamentally about well-being, and that's the priority, then you have to decide, okay, how can we ensure well-being, and how can we make sure that whatever resource we've got is contributing to well-being? Don't call it a business case. I think that suggests that it's only ever about money, and the money is the yay or nay. It might not even need money. It might just need a different sort of framing of understanding. So I think we've got a lot to do yet. I think I would ask everybody, next time you listen to the radio, listen to the norms that you are hearing without even hearing them, and how we hear how success and growth and well-being are framed without ever being questioned. We don't have a well-being metric. We don't have a well-being index. We still only use GDP. It's still delivered as the only way of measuring benefits. To my mind now, quite a long time ago, we should have been measuring carbon as some sort of metric, as well as ecological resilience and environmental growth, as well as human being well-being. Those surely are much more important metrics than exactly how much we are growing. But I do think that in actual fact, all you need to do really to consider using this on a sort of town basis or a community basis is just start having a bit like climate, just start having the conversation, get a picture of the donut and start looking at all of those issues. And if you've got any sort of strategy or any sort of project or any sort of bigger, wide, community-wide project, just have a conversation about the donut and see if your combination of projects or individual projects are actually delivering positively on all of those. Because if there's something, one project or one strategy that is delivering negatively on any of those, then you're going to have to make sure that everything else is compensating for that big time, or change the project.
Melissa from the Helston Climate Action Group is saying, well, just to follow that up, can we consider use of donut model as a tool for developing a local town council strategy? And are you aware of well-being tools for the same use, i.e. for the town council strategy? And that's, I think,
yes, absolutely. I think it's perfectly possible and in fact advisable and a really, really bloody good idea to start thinking about donut when you're talking about strategy, because the thing with strategic plans is that you can end up putting something in place that you end up having to deliver even though the context might have changed within 6 months, or getting locked into things. The reason at the moment why the council is about, or has just signed, I believe, the commitment to hand over a huge amount of money for flights from Newquay to Gatwick, which I think is abhorrent actually, at the same time as closing leisure centres, because they own the airport and the airport needs those flights to be viable. That is the opposite of donut thinking. They've been locked into something where they have to keep the airport going or think they have to, so they have to put that money into the flights. And it just happens to be the same amount of money that could have been used to keep leisure centres open. We've got a health crisis, we've got a mental health crisis across the city, across the county. We've got isolation and loneliness crises happening across the county. Surely leisure centres, I'm not a fan of leisure centres, I don't use them. Loads of people do. Surely that would have been a better investment, and it would have actually hit lots and lots of those things around the donut in terms of the planetary boundaries and the social foundation goals. So it can be a mechanism or a lens through which you can look at every single decision and either tweak it, like the bike repair workshop, already doing brilliant things on lots of those segments, but could also do even more with barely any effort. But will also challenge some of those projects to say, actually, maybe this is not just a tweak, this is the wrong project, or this is the wrong decision about spending the money.
Yeah. John James had said, how do we move this concept into the mainstream? refers to the Netherlands government and so on. We've got a long way to go. I mean, I thought Kate's 5 sort of stages was very succinct. If you're a business organization particularly, you might either do nothing as a response to climate emergency or whatever. The second stage is maybe you just do the things that pay. The third stage is you do your fair share of proportional to the rest of the civilization's infrastructure, I suppose. The fourth stage is do no harm. And then the fifth stage is be generous. And actually, if you can move as many people on to being generous as early as possible, that's what will really help, to me.
It is, but in some ways, I would absolutely agree. But it's also about enlightened self-interest. I mean, the analogy I used this morning for some of the students were the notion around Extinction Rebellion, about telling the truth and acting now. And it's exactly the same with this. We're in a boat with a really big hole in it in terms of our planetary raft. And not only are we not acknowledging it or not naming it, we're not doing anything about it either. Whereas in natural fact, what we could do with doing is naming it, doing something about it, and getting rid of the old structures like GDP or the old metrics. Say, what is it we need? You know, there isn't a business case for fixing a hole in the boat, for God's sake. It's to do with survival and the well-being of everybody. So start getting everybody's ideas to figure out how we can use what we've got, somebody's coat or a bit of wood or a bit of netting, whatever it might be, to fix the hole in the boat, make that a collective effort, because it serves everybody's interests. And this is exactly the same. If we have a more collective, collaborative, shared, Rubik's Cube, enlightened way of thinking about economics and sharing, it's better for everybody. And good Lord, if you need to have a little look at different ways of thinking about economics, look for Hajun Chang on YouTube. He's an economics professor at Cambridge, and he's got a fantastic clip where he talks about nobody dares talk about economics. We have views on everything else, but we just think that economics is only for the experts. It's absolute nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. Anybody who's ever decided whether to buy a loaf of bread or a bus ticket or a box of tea bags is engaging in economics. Anybody who's decided whether to paint one wall or 6 walls in their bedroom or to turn an old jumper into a tank top is practicing economics. It's just managing the resources that we've got. In terms of money economics, he says that we think, not only do we not think that we're experts, which we all are, we hand it over to somebody else, usually in a suit, usually in a tower somewhere in very high tower, making decisions about money that will affect us ultimately. That can't be right. But we misunderstand how we can engage ourselves in criticizing and critiquing the different sorts. He says that we think that this is the economics model that we've got here, the neoclassical model, is the only one there is. It's absolute nonsense. There are at least a dozen models that are being used all over the world, and then lots more all over the place. We do not see the water we swim in, and there are places that operate on a completely different basis. I was reading about one country where there's hunting that goes on in the forest. I can't remember whereabouts it was. And when the group of hunters has a kill and finds an animal and kills it and eats it, they then leave little, I think it was a tropical rainforest or some description somewhere. I can't remember where it was. I'll have to go and find out. They leave little markers in the trees and the plants nearby. So if there's any other hunter passing, those little markers in the trees, little bits of twigs and stones in the trees to say simply, we have a kill, we're this way, come and share it with us. It's the opposite of accumulation and extraction, which is what all of our economic models are based on. It's like, here's something, therefore it is ours, as opposed to there's something, therefore it's mine. It's a completely different way of thinking about managing and sharing. It means that nothing is wasted, because if you're hunting in the forest, you have to eat it all or it'll be wasted. So share it, enable more people to share it. It's well used, and then more people get to partake in success over here. You know, it's ridiculous to think of economics in any other way.
I mean, one of the things that I think is such an all-pervasive idea, that it is so all-pervasive that we can hardly see it, is that idea that you can somehow buy yourself out of situations. You know, people think I could start a new business and make a killing, then I'll be set up for life. I could win the lottery. And then you look at like the ultimate case of someone like Peter Thiel, the PayPal founder, buying up land in New Zealand because he's anticipating an apocalypse and he wants a safe place to go to. But, if that apocalypse actually happened, then he's just going to be terrified of all the people who are working for him on his estate, because they're going to be gunning for him. So he is not able to buy himself out. And so it's like a completely wrong idea.
It absolutely is. If anybody gets an opportunity, have a little look at what Douglas Rushkoff have got to say. He's a very interesting thinker. And I saw him give a talk a couple of years ago. He thinks about the relationship between human beings and tech, and is very alarmed by this enhancement sense of wanting lots of tech implants to make us into better human beings. He is on the side, as he says, as team human. And during his talk, he told this story whereby he'd been contacted by somebody. He gives talks and lectures all the time about the future of tech. And he'd been asked by somebody to go and give a talk, and the fee for it, he said, was essentially half of his annual professorial salary. So he thought, well, okay, that's a lot of money for me to talk, but I can talk about this. It's what I do every day. So he went and he went into what he thought was the green room behind what he thought was the lecture hall, where he expected, for such a huge sum of money, thousands and thousands of people to be sitting. And then three or four men came in and sat down in front of him, and he suddenly realized that was his audience. These men alone had paid that amount of money to have him come and talk to them. And they had a little bit of chit chat to begin with. And he thought he was going to have to give his talk about the future of tech to them. And in fact, not. Basically, what they wanted from him was assurance, because they said, how do I make the robots that will look after the warehouses where I keep all my wealth? Because the robots will need to have the security code, and that means human beings might have to have the security code. So how can I look after all of my wealth if human beings have got the security code, which means ultimately it's not safe? And he went, oh, and they were having sleepless nights over this because they had so much wealth. They realized the only way they could keep it safe was not having human beings look after it, but having robots do the security, so there's no human being involved at all. And he just said, don't have the wealth, dudes. This is ridiculous. You've now got yourself into a situation where you have so much stuff, you have to stash it. And you realize now that there will be a moment when people say, well, that's not fair because I've got nothing, and you've got almost everything, and they will come after it. So your only concern now is the security of that, to stop other people having a small amount of it. That's mad. It's completely mad. If you didn't have all that, you just had enough for you, but you distribute it, you wouldn't have the problem. This problem is a function of your own massive wealth. And he was really stunned at their level of angst about trying to protect this enormous, unimaginable amount of wealth that they suddenly realized they couldn't protect anymore because somebody somewhere might know the security key, and so they wouldn't be able to keep it secure if human beings were involved at all. So that was telling. Have a little look for Douglas Rushkoff online. He's a very excellent speaker.
I think there's a lot of quite very sort of alien thinking that has been written about perhaps at the end of the 20th century, saying in fact that the rich don't exploit the poor exploit the rich because the rich are so inventive and clever. And I think there's a lot of stuff out there that it suits certain people like Peter Thiel to adopt. But just to go right back to something that was said before, Leslie had said, needing a business plan for health and well-being misses the obvious that when people are not well, they cost the state. It's economically viable to have people who are well.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And at the moment, we haven't got a national health service. We have a national sickness service. And there's so much demand. And yet maybe some of what we're doing is it's the ridiculousness of not investing in leisure centres. It's not investing in making sure we manage our communities, making sure that kids in housing estates can actually get to the beach, which they can't do in Cornwall, for God's sake. Making sure we're putting prevention and making sure we're understanding the importance of great food at an early age. All of that stuff is investing in health and well-being. And if you want to think about it in terms of money, it will cost less. and which is just a rubbish way of thinking about it, if that's all that matters to you. But the point that Les is making is absolutely, even if you only want to think about that, it costs less to keep people well, and you're just investing in people's well-being and health. Like, why do we have to make an argument for that being the right thing to do? It's absolute nonsense, and it just shows you how we've got sucked into this, I think.
But it's interesting that so much of this contribution to health and well-being is done by volunteer groups. I mean, so many of the things like the Gleaning Project and the incredible Helston Climate, as Melissa again is talking about, the incredible Edible Project. It's all volunteers, really, perhaps with a small grant. Incredibly admirable, but it would be very nice if it could be rolled out.
Well, it is, and we shouldn't underestimate, there's stuff happening absolutely everywhere. In fact, I would say that all the good stuff is happening absolutely everywhere. It's just by people who are sometimes very quietly, sometimes very noisily getting on with it, with incredible things all over the place. And if it weren't for that, then God knows where we'd be. Actually, one of the things that I found upsetting is there was something on the radio a couple of years ago, and there were a couple of people from the city who were in charge of lots and lots of numbers, who just said, they were asked, how many volunteers do you think there are in the UK? And they said, oh, I don't know, a couple of thousand. And of course, it's to the order of 10 or 100 of that. There are hundreds of that. I mean, goodness me, we had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of volunteers just in Cornwall during COVID. There are hundreds of thousands of people volunteering across the UK doing all sorts of things for the benefit of the community and for the benefit of themselves, and not a penny changes hands, but lots of love and care and well-being and connection does. And that surely should be our currency, our metric of success, is how happy and well-being we are. And by happy, I don't mean constantly smiling. I mean happy as in able to make your own decisions and feeling that you've got a sense of self and that you can participate and that you're valued. That's what we mean by well-being, actually. I also have the right to cry and be incredibly sad, maybe at a sad song or at somebody being hurt, but that's also part of well-being, where you are free to do that and you're free to do something about it. So yeah, absolutely, I agree. It's nonsense. I think Melissa said as well, it's quite difficult to encourage people to share. Like that. We used to do that. We did used to do that all the time when I was a kid. That's how stuff got moved around, ideas and kits and information and clothes and food. And people now fear that that is not okay, or it's an indication of financial poverty, which is a no-no. I don't know, it's strange. We've got a lot that we have to change, but we do it by just modelling different behaviour.
David Smart Knight says this sharing story is true with knowledge. This society says, this is my knowledge. If you want, I'll sell it to you. But in Indigenous cultures, it's the responsibility of the experts to train others to become better than them, just ensuring the community has the necessary skills. So
absolutely, it's about a collaborative effort, isn't it? And that sense of, that notion of Ubuntu, I am because we are. We seem to have lost that.
Yeah.
So Pamela says part of the slipped up the screen. Part of the metrics of economics is time. How quickly can using the donut model impact in any meaningful level?
Immediately, actually, just by having the conversation. You're not going to get a citywide Amsterdam-like transformative plan overnight, but you might start some really interesting conversations going where somebody said, oh yeah, I never really thought that my shop had to deliver community benefit. I've never really thought about that before. And enabling them to find out ways. So I think you can have impact straight away. And the more you can point to examples of it being used elsewhere, the better, which is the entire point of the Deal website. So do use that. I just want to refer to the comment that Helen made about volunteers do often need money to train them. Absolutely. That's just about resourcing and provisioning in the same way I need food to eat and water to drink. But that's not a sort of a transactional money thing. That's just simply about moving. I have energy put in with me, and then I use that energy well, and investing back in the place. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to make sure, in fact required to make sure that volunteers are well resourced with money if that's what they've spent, or time or equipment. And it shouldn't have cost you money, and I'm sorry about that. The problem is that we don't value them in the same way we don't value teachers and we don't value NHS staff. This is what Tim Jackson talks about when he talks about low carbon economy. It's not just and green jobs. It's not just about insulating houses, which is a really important green job, but it's also about caring and working with your community. That's a really low carbon, high quality impact job. And we should be investing in those as well. And if that were more possible, and then hopefully the volunteering will be just doing the stuff around the edges. But we haven't got that model yet. Ours to fight for, I believe.
I mean, to me, in terms of bringing about that kind of change, is endlessly presenting this as actually a very solid, well thought through thing. And if you just read Kate's book and you see the origin of GDP in the 1930s, just a sort of idea that was cooked up, and then because of the Cold War, it kind of gained momentum. The USA fighting the Soviet Union and so on, wanting to show off. And then what's the guy in the 1950s, Kunstler, was it, who did a lot of studies and came up with this idea very briefly that in order to make things better, you had to accept a degree of difference in wealth levels for a bit of pain before you got some gain. And I think even he renounced the idea later, but it was too late. It had already become like the norm. And so actually these things that are all pervasive and then they seem to be so solid to us because of that. Yeah. Actually, they're not solid at all.
You're absolutely right.
Ideas.
Yeah, absolutely right. GDP, as you say, it is a measure of a country's readiness for war. That's what it was constructed for. It's complete nonsense. It's not at all a sensible metric of success. But, you know, as Marshall McLuhan said, he was another guy who talked about tech and society. He famously said, "We don't know who it was that discovered water, but we're pretty sure it wasn't a fish." And what he meant by that is that we do not see the water we swim in. You know, when something becomes a normative culture, it becomes body temperature and we stop questioning it. So all of this, the heart of all of this is, and Kate's a renegade economist. She was renegade because she kicked the tires, she deployed critical thinking. She said, what if? I'm not sure that's the right way to do it. And she is a critical thinker, a courageous disruptor, a positive deviant. And we all need to deploy that now and not just sit and accept, say, no, actually, that's not okay. Angela Davis, the famous academic and civil rights activist, said in the 60s, I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I cannot accept. And for that, you need to look around and see what it is that you have been accepting. You think, actually, that's not cool. You think of women's rights, and slowly the conversation is erring towards, hold on a second, it's not about how I behave or when I go out or what I wear. It's actually about the behavior of people who might want to harm me. That's what needs to change. But you've got used to assuming it's my responsibility to wear the right things and not go down a particular street at a particular time. And if I haven't got my keys in my hand, then that's my fault. Changing that round, saying, no, it's not my fault at all. I should be able to wear whatever I want, whenever I want. The issue is the behavior that people might want to harm. And it's the same with economics. Like, what's actually good for us? And what have we been told is the only way of measuring it? You look at stuff that you read in the paper, stuff that's on the news, stuff that's on the radio, all the presumptions. It's not that people are bad, just that is what they have infused like a tea bag as being, this is the only way of measuring success. And if you listen to what Kate says, she said the person who drew one of the first diagrams to show inflows and outflows of the economy was to a bunch of engineers, and he drew effectively a radiator of stuff going in and stuff going out. Whereas everything that Kate talks about and everything that other progressive economists talk about, Tim Jackson and Steve Quinn and lots of others, they talk about a much more circular and restorative program where whatever is taken out is going back into invest. Just like an apple tree takes nutrients from the ground, especially if you plant comfrey there, using the ground, up the trunk, into the apples, and then as the leaves and into the leaves, and the leaves store all the nutrients, and then the leaves fall, we're seeing them all fall now, and then they feed the soil. So it's not the leaves of the trees are dying. They're doing this really incredibly clever thing where they're loading all of those nutrients into the soil so the tree can grow again next year. They don't grow apples and then kill off the tree. And if trees can do that, like, God, Why can't we?
There's a lovely page in the book where there's a couple of photographs that says it's more about using secateurs than it is about spanners, and there's photographs of both. And that made me think, because I've been involved myself in sort of small scale business development and social enterprise development, and it is very much like gardening, I think, kind of tweak things here and there and so on. And it really made me think of the Community of Dragons thing that has happened in Totnes. So just say a little bit about that. It's happened on other occasions and in other towns, I think in the southwest. And I'd really like to get something similar happening in Penzance. And it happens on an evening of the year, and it's like a version of Dragon's Den, but it's nice instead of nasty. And the people who put together various projects, and they some of them are set up to be profit-making projects, some of them are social enterprises and so on, a whole range, and they do very brief presentations. And then the people in the audience put up their hands and make offers of things that they can help. Maybe they'll, buy a year's worth of bread in advance from a bakery, or they'll give some mentoring, or they'll invest some money, or they'll invest some time, and that sort of thing. And to me, that's the closest I've seen to developing those kind of hybrid business social enterprise models that would fit very nicely in the donut, actually.
Absolutely right. And you can see, Cornwall has got social enterprises coming out of its ears now, and social enterprises and CICs. And I think David says, what's in the way of using the donut at UK level? The only thing that's in the way of using the donut at UK level is because that sort of business operation that Jonathan's just described is seen as weird and out there, rather than actually exactly what we need so much more of. Because to be honest, most of the people in charge of the decisions at UK government level have been brought up in a particular way to believe that the only metric is GDP, and the only way of seeing success is economic growth. And it's really alien for them to understand this. So I think the response is, we do it locally, we do it anyway. I think it was Asad Rehman who said at the end of COP26, hope does not lie with you, hope lies with us, and we don't compromise on justice. And I think that's a very powerful thing to say to the COP leadership, in the same way we can. We are where the change happens. We are, as they say, the people we've been waiting for, and we just need to start using the donuts. In the same way, we just need to start having conversations about climate and ecological breakdown. We just need to start having conversations about what economics really is and how we can use it for us and our places, rather than as an extractive tool.
I think it'd be nice if Derek's there, if he would answer that one. But in the meantime, I think it's interesting to see how an organisation like the Committee on Climate Change is influencing the government towards a different interpretation of success. Is it doing that? Is that going to be some sort of a way forward?
Oh, that's a good question. I think they are trying. Not all of their advice is taken up. I think there are lots of people who are trying to have these conversations. I've heard Kate, for example, talk on Woman's Hour. I have requested that people like Kevin Anderson and Kate and a whole slew of other alternative thinkers about economics and climate and social well-being are interviewed on sort of our flagship news programmes. I think Kevin Anderson got 3 minutes on Radio 4 the other morning. But if you listen to who is interviewed, they are a very specific set of ideas that are rolled out again and again and again. And even the people that are questioning them are only questioning them within that framing. Nobody is saying is, but what if all of your ideas might need to change and there's an absolute alternative that's still emerging? What if? Nobody is doing that. Nobody's quite brave enough, because people don't realise perhaps how steeped they are in somebody else's idea. So I think the CCC is probably trying in some ways to alter ideas, but the whole point of this, I think, is that we all need to do all of these things together and to support